First of all, let me introduce you ARIELLE DENIS, Director of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons.
Campaign to abolish nuclear weapons for Europe, Middle East and Africa. Elle est d'abord journaliste spécialisée.
She is a journalist specialized in international affairs and conflict. She has co-directed the movement of peace in France from 2002 and 2010. She holds a master's degree in international affairs and strategic affairs.
International humanitarian law, et bien sûr, elle a publié plusieurs copies.
And she has published several papers on peace and disarmament. So it's a real pleasure to have her today. We are really pleased to have you with us today.
Vous connaissez sans doute aussi l'autre petite adresse électronique.
So the other web address is as follows: don'tbackonthebomb.org. This is a website where you have tons of information about tens of people that are investing money in nuclear business in Canada, United States, tens of billions of dollars. So austerity is not for everybody, apparently. Arielle, you have the floor. We are very honored to have you here today.
Merci beaucoup. Moi, je voudrais surtout vous remercier.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank you for having me. I'm very happy to be here. I would like to thank people from the First Nations. Thank you for welcoming me. And I'm really happy to be with you in Quebec. It's the first time that I'm visiting Canada. I would like to thank the organizers that were so kind with me so far. And also I'd like to thank especially HELEN CALDICOTT, Dr. CALDICOTT. She has done so much in the Pacific against the French nuclear testing. She has been very important in our fight in France. I wanted to thank her especially. I'm honored to be with her on that stage, on this panel. Right away, I'd like to present a 5-minute video session. This was the video that we have presented in the International Campaign for the Abolition of Nuclear Arms. This was presented at the Vienna conference last December, which was the third conference on the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons, organized by the Austria government. 158 countries have participated in that effort, and the video has led to the declaration of civil society. We have wanted to show, so we have this video about it now, and there are many things in that video, and then I'm going to give a few comments, because things are changing. There are new doors opening, new opportunities. We have to discuss these matters. There are many new things happening on the international stage right now. Let's watch the video.
Nuclear weapons are not someone else's problem. Their destructive power is so vast that its effects won't stop at national borders. Human beings will be the target, and cities will be annihilated. Humanitarian relief organizations admit that there is little they could do to help the survivors of a nuclear detonation. Nuclear weapons continue to be a global humanitarian threat. They require a united global response. Injustice is never someone else's problem. That's what Nelson Mandela understood as he suffered in prison for all those years. A society needs to be based on inclusion and human rights, not divided by the color of one's skin.
Our task, of course, is not an easy one, but nor was ending apartheid in South Africa. Through perseverance, conviction, and determination, we defeated the forces of injustice and hatred. We won because we stood on the right side of history. We stood for a just and moral cause. And you, too, stand on the right side of history.
change does not happen overnight. It is a long road that needs vision, courage, and commitment. But change needs a starting point. A moment of truth when we rise up and demand what is long overdue. That's what feminists in many countries did by campaigning for women's right to vote. By claiming their rights, those women rejected the status quo and called it for what it was: oppression. Progress often means changing the rules. It was outrage about the effects of anti-personnel landmines that fueled the work of the international campaign to ban landmines. Hundreds of thousands of civilians were killed or maimed by these indiscriminate weapons. Cities, villages, and farmland became battlefields, and fear walked with every man, woman, and child wherever landmines had been used.
Within 5 years, we took an issue that nobody was talking about and achieved a ban. And then what was so important about our work then was that we took a weapon that had been in use for generations and we changed the framework of discussion. We turned it into an issue of humanitarian disarmament. When we were really excited and celebrating the successful negotiation of the Mine Ban Treaty, and then in Ottawa, Canada in December of '97, 122 countries coming together in 2 days to join that treaty, we were often kind of assaulted, if you will, by the media, saying the US isn't there, Russia isn't there, China isn't there. Doesn't that make your treaty irrelevant? And our response was, of course not. How can you say that 122 nations signing a treaty is irrelevant?
More and more nations are facing up to the horrifying evidence of what nuclear bombs actually do. Governments and civil society are shaking off years of complacency and changing the game. We are calling nuclear weapons for what they really are: inhumane, useless, and unacceptable. Now, we need to have the courage to take the next step and develop a treaty that makes nuclear weapons illegal. We are closer than you might think, and we will pursue this treaty, even if the nuclear-armed countries oppose it. We will have the courage to ask every political leader in the world, are nuclear weapons acceptable or are they not? We are confident that the vast majority will agree that they should be outlawed and will work with us towards a ban. Every generation has a chance to change the world. This is the generation that will ban nuclear weapons forever.
Bon, merci beaucoup.
Well, thank you. And so this is just an overview. It's an overview of our campaign. I wanted to insist in this short presentation about what happened during the last few years in order to see how the civil society can go even further in order to make things better and in order to forbid nuclear weapons as well as landmines. Most people and even leaders of nuclear-armed countries, they say that they want a world without nuclear weapons. Everybody understands that the impacts of nuclear weapons are totally unacceptable. The majority of states, almost all the southern hemisphere, has forbidden nuclear weapons already in the creation of areas without nuclear weapons. And now we recognize that the risk of explosion of nuclear weapons has never been as high. The risk is very high. At the same time, Despite that discourse, that danger that everybody is aware of, nuclear-armed countries are all investing in new generations of nuclear weapons. Billions of dollars are being invested in nuclear weapons. And the states, members of military alliances such as Canada, have their own security doctrines, and they think about potentially using nuclear weapons. They are thinking that it's possible that they might participate in the use of nuclear weapons in the future. Diplomatic efforts in favor of nuclear disarmament are stopped right now in terms of proliferation or for the disarmament conference, which meets during the whole year, and they have not been able to agree even just on the agenda after 17 years. So there is a larger distance now between these countries that have nuclear weapons that are proposing a step-by-step approach, and a greater number of countries that think that we should go right away into multilateral negotiations to go forward. However, so there's a greater divide, and that situation, which seemed to be stopped for the last 40 years now, the debate has started to move into a new joint effort between governments, civil society, and large humanitarian organizations such as the Red Cross, because now we are seeing that there is a shift in terms of security concerns towards other types of humanitarian problems due to the impact of nuclear weapons. And so the humanitarian initiatives, the humanitarian initiative at the United Nations, that's how it's called. This has started in the 2010 Non-Proliferation Conference. In the final text of that conference, states have accepted the idea that the states are concerned about the humanitarian catastrophic impacts of nuclear weapons. This might not seem to be a lot, but we, the civil society, have been talking about these impacts for a while now, for a long time. But for the states, it's the first time that states are acknowledging it. They are not only talking about their security concerns. Now they are starting to talk about the impacts of the weapons, the humanitarian terrible impacts on human beings. So that same type of shift happened also, if you remember that campaign regarding landmines a while ago, when they did not they were not talking anymore only about security issues, but then they started talking about the danger of these weapons for human beings. Now, this turning point is the 2010 TNP conference. Other events happened since that date. There is a special working group that was gathered in 2013. Then there was a high-level meeting where leaders of the entire world participated in, and also there were several joint declarations that were made that mention that the humanitarian approach, that humanitarian impacts have to be the basis of any type of international debate regarding nuclear weapons. And so now there has been, at the beginning, only 16 countries that signed a joint agreement during the preparation of TNP conference in 2012, and then 35 countries in 2012, and then 80 countries had signed in 2013 after the initiative of South Africa, and then 125 countries in 2013, and then 156 countries at the last United Nations General Session in 2014. 166 countries signed that declaration, saying that not only the humanitarian approach has to be at the basis of any type of agreement, but also that nuclear weapons, the use of these weapons, is not justifiable under any circumstances. Under any circumstances, and this is what makes a difference of that declaration. In parallel to these processes that are happening at the United Nations, 3 international conferences on the humanitarian impacts happened. The first one in Oslo in March 2013. That seems to be a while ago, but this was just 2 years ago. And also Norway, a NATO country just like Canada, has invited all the countries of the world to discuss the impacts of nuclear weapons by inviting experts. Also, large international organizations were invited, as well as the civil society. And so the results of this first conference are that there doesn't exist two things. This is very important. These are facts. These have become facts following these conferences. There is no national nor international organization that should take care of all the impacts of the explosion of a nuclear weapon. And the second conclusion is that the impacts of nuclear weapons don't have any limit in time or in space. So there are global impacts for the environment, health, the economy, and so on. And these conferences have been at the source of new studies in the wake of new research, and now we are able, for instance, there is a research on nuclear winter, and what we know now is that this would mean something catastrophic. It was very interesting to see how diplomats that participated in these conferences ignored the reality of the full scope of damage created by nuclear weapons. The second conference happened in Nayarit by the Mexican government. 146 countries attended, and the vice minister at the conference said, we have to take into account that in the past weapons, first they wanted to forbid them, and we think that this is the way to proceed in order to get rid of nuclear weapons. He also said this year in 2015, which is the 75th anniversary of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that would be a very good year to start international negotiations to ban nuclear weapons. Also, what was interesting at the Nayarit conference is that several studies were presented about the risks and the under-assessment of the risk of explosion, accidental explosion of nuclear weapons. There was one Chatham House study, and the other from the book of Eric Schlosser called Content Control. In that book, they study declassified documents that are really scary. These are declassified documents that show how we have been on the verge many times of having accidental nuclear weapons exploding or missiles strikes that were could have been accidentally launched. So there's no certainty that such an accident will not happen in the near future. So this is very important because this adds one urgency level for the abolition of nuclear weapons. Finally, there is the Vienna conference last December. This young man that you see is the Minister of Foreign Affairs from Austria. 158 countries participated in Vienna. And what's interesting is that the United States and Great Britain participated as well. Prior to that, there was Pakistan, India, that participated in the former conferences, but it's the first time that countries from the G5 participated in the conference. So this is an interesting sign to follow, because so far the humanitarian initiative was just something to be considered interesting, right? It was just interesting, and then suddenly they started to attend. Well, they wanted to show their interest, and so this conference was starting to become a must. But also, they wanted to see what other countries like NATO countries like Canada wanted to say. And so the pressure was very high on many in order to prevent allies to say sometimes maybe what they would have wanted to say. So some of the conclusions of the Vienna conference are the commitment from Austria, which is a proposal by the Austrian government to the other states of the world, saying the following. There is a gap, there is a law gap, and so all these nuclear massive weapons of destruction are not under the rule of law right now. And so we need to address this legal gap on the international level. We invite you, with the civil society, with other large humanitarian organizations, to gather and to start envisaging, discussing these matters. And this is going to be the basis of the next conference, which is going to be the following conference after the Vienna conference. And so I'd like to say a few words about this banning of nuclear weapons. A treaty to ban nuclear weapons. This is something new for the movement of abolition of nuclear weapons. This is a step which is being formed. It's going to be the next step that's going to get to the elimination of nuclear weapons. So in this treaty, they want to change the evidence. Whether you want it or not, nuclear states said that if weapons are used, well, it would be possible to clean. It would be possible to go back to a former situation. So it was up to you to prove it that it was not possible. And could that be under international law? Then that would lead us also to create alliances with the other governments, with the civil society, with some new objectives. Then we also wanted to get conclusions from other treaties. There have been some treaties, especially the last two former treaties that were done for landmines, for instance. These are former treaties that should be looked into and should be used as an inspiration. And we would be the victims. Whatever happens, the civil society will be the victims of nuclear weapons. So we can give the floor to survivors, to nuclear victims, and so on. And we have to continue doing so. And so for every advancement of humanity, the civil society has always played a key role, of course. All right, so just to make a small comparison between the difference between the traditional approach for disarmament and the humanitarian approach, well, here is a list. So first, there is the control of weapons, which gives the floor, gives the role to these countries that have nuclear weapons. It's up to them to negotiate, right? And then we just wait in the meantime. This is what happens since for the last 70 years. We just have to wait and say nothing. While in the humanitarian approach, everybody is responsible to protect the planet. Every government has to protect their people. So again, this is a more encompassing approach. So civil society and non-nuclear states, the Red Cross, for instance, and other large organizations have a word to say, and they play a greater role. And so every countries that are members of these areas free from nuclear weapons also have a greater say. Now, in the regular approach, it's a national approach of security. If you speak with French people, I'm French, they say, we need nuclear weapons. This is our life insurance. So what about Uganda? Uganda could say, we also need a life insurance. We would need nuclear weapons. So as you can see, it's not sustainable. It's not a sustainable vision for nuclear weapons. And of course, if you say the humanitarian approach is rather having an approach where we have to discuss these matters, including global human concerns as well. And then control of weapons. This is discussed in small privileged groups, but our own approach is that it can be negotiated anywhere, anytime. We just have to gather a significant number of states. Remember the first meeting about the anti-landmine conference. There were not even 50 states. So this is a process that allows us to go forward. Then following that, there's the control of weapons. As I said before, this is a step-by-step strategy. So if you ask what's the next step, there is a debate between these nuclear-armed countries. Some say the United States have to sign a treaty. There's no strategy. They don't have any strategy because they don't agree. they don't want to get rid of the nuclear weapons. And so with the humanitarian approach, rather, we address the real issues, the weapons themselves. We are not against the country that have nuclear weapons. We are against the nuclear weapons themselves. And this is what makes a big difference.
Donc voilà, pour conclure, un traité
To conclude, a treaty to ban would put pressure in order to eliminate nuclear weapons and strengthen the obligations right now, strengthen non-proliferation treaty and the treaty on trials. In doing so, we increase the political costs to acquire those weapons, restrain access to investments, and problem on the Switzerland, for example, and Norway also banned acquiring the nuclear weapon. That will increase cooperation and will create also what is very important, a community of stakeholders who have an interest in this with the organizations of the UN, the governments, and the civil society. Here's what is on the table. We're not expecting too much from the TNT in a few weeks. What we expect, however, is a few countries mentioning their interest for a new binding legal instrument. That's their jargon, mentioning their interest for such a treaty. About 60 nations already mentioned it in an official declaration. We also are asking for the non-proliferation treaty be strengthened, especially the Section 6. But the summary from the last 4 years is very bad on the 64 items in which we agreed in 2010, while very few were enacted on the 22 items for disarmament. They held 5 meetings to determine a glossary to understand what we are talking about. So it needs to pick up some speed, and this is what we are left with. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Arielle. Your video started with these immortal words: remember your humanity and forget the rest. And they were told by Albert Einstein. That's why I used this ridiculous German accent, sorry. And also Bertrand Russell. It's the declaration that founded, actually, Pugwash International with Joseph Rotblat, who received this Nobel Prize in 1995. I also belong to the Canadian Network to the Abolition of Nuclear Weapons, presided by Bev DeLong and animated by Douglas Roach. Thank you so much for all these very interesting words. Maybe you'll get the next Nobel Prize eventually. I agree that it's an impasse for the disarmament conference, which relies on consensus. I'm sure you will receive some questions from the hall, because the TNP is still sort of putting forward the success of their negotiations with Iran. And of course, the success is not yet confirmed, and there are many enemies to these things. But we'll see that later. Now, it's a great pleasure and privilege. I couldn't dream to have this role to introduce to you Helen CALDICOTT, pediatrician specializing in cystic fibrosis. Elle a mené le mouvement en 1971 en Australie contre les essais nucléaires atmosphériques.
She began her work in 1971 against the uranium mining. She was the physician, co-founder of Physician for Social Responsibility, well-known author for nuclear issues and also to prevent nuclear war, recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize in '85, the CALDICOTT organization. Also, she produced a movie, If You Love This Planet.
So, Helen, please come.
Please, Helen, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I also will start with a quote from Einstein. The splitting of the atom changed everything, all reality, save man's mode of thinking. Thus we drift towards unparalleled catastrophe. I just need my water. I'm very heartened by what ICAN is doing. I think it's an extraordinary thing. But being a physician, I have to face reality. If we've got a patient in the intensive care unit, we can't say to ourselves, well, the electrolytes are balanced, the cardiac function's good, the liver function's good, kidneys aren't so good, but we'll ignore that. So when I look at the situation globally from a physician's perspective, there's one very, very, very important sticking point, and that's the United States. Without getting them involved, we'll get nowhere. They invented the nuclear weapons. They made every step in the development of nuclear weapons except one, and Russia blindly, stupidly copied and followed. They are heavily invested in their nuclear arsenal now and want to replace it to the tune of $1 trillion over the next 30 years. That happened because Obama wanted the Senate to pass the START II treaty, but Senator Kyle, a Republican, said, we'll pass the START II treaty in the Senate if you promise $1 trillion to replace every single nuclear weapon and delivery system over the next 30 years. The people who really run the United States are the military-industrial complex. 65 to 66 cents of every discretional tax dollar goes to the Pentagon and to the nuclear industry. So it's interesting that, in fact, the main industries of the United States now are socialized. So the United States is sort of a socialistic country with capitalism for the poor little people who can't afford medical care and the like. Although they say they're capitalists, they're not. And the driving force, the most powerful companies are the military-industrial complex, headed by Lockheed Martin. Boeing is a huge military company making missiles. They're planning for war in space. They're in fact militarizing space now. And they say they'll, quotes, affect very many kills from space. Northrop Grumman and many other companies are deeply involved in the building of weapons. They're very clever because, for instance, the B-52, when it was being made, or the B-1 bomber, whichever one, the ejection seat was made in Florida, the wheels were made in California, the electronics were made in another state. So they've organised it so that in every single state and every single electorate, there are military corporations. So therefore, the senators and Congress people tend to vote for the weapon systems for jobs. And I've said for many years, Hitler, I'm sure, said we need to build the gas ovens to create jobs. Well, now we're creating the global gas oven. literally, metaphorically, the global gas oven. Because I talked yesterday about a single bomb dropping on Quebec, but there are so many bombs, we've got overkill, many, like about 6 times. That's a Pentagon term, overkill, which means you kill the people, they stand up again, you kill them and they stand up again. Only a Pentagon term, not a medical term. Russia's got over 1,000 H-bombs on hair trigger alert, ready to go with the press of the button, and America's got over 1,000 too, ready to go with the press of the button. Nuclear war would take about an hour to complete as both weapons cross mid-space. And as the cities burn, and it's changed because the cities are now full of oil refineries and rubber and plastic and wood, huge amounts of radioactive toxic smoke will rise up into the stratosphere and cover the Earth with a cloud so thick it will block out the sun for up to 10 years. A. B, almost all the ozone will be destroyed, so if you stayed out in the outside for just a few minutes, you'll go blind and you'll get 3rd-degree sunburn within 3 minutes. Actually, you can't go outside for 6 months because the fallout will be so intense you have to stay in your shelter. The Federal Emergency Management Agency has been planning to send the old people out as food gatherers because we won't live long enough to get our cancers. So the whole, and then as the Earth is shrouded in black smoke, it actually blocks out the sun for, I said, up to 10 years, inducing a short ice age where everything and everyone freezes to death in the dark. Now, if there's a small nuclear war between India and Pakistan, which is actually very likely, because all sorts of things are happening on the border skirmishes, and people are fallible. Some people are mad. Some people go crazy when they're threatened. All sorts of possibilities could occur. If only 100 nuclear weapons use the size of the Hiroshima bomb, it would create nuclear war autumn with so much smoke in the northern hemisphere that there would be a dreadful failure of crops for years and years, and over 1 billion people would die. In America, almost every person is totally ignorant now about the threat of nuclear war. In fact, the Cold War's over. Don't even think about it. And I remember when the Cold War ended and the Berlin Wall came down, we all thought, thank God that's over. We were so tired. We laid on our couches and relaxed. But in fact, the weapons were not removed. When Gorbachev signed the treaty or agreed with James Baker, Secretary of State under George I, they agreed that America would not enlarge NATO, The exact opposite has happened because, you see, when the Cold War ended, it was devastating to the military-industrial complex and millions of jobs, because what are they going to make weapons for now because there's no Cold War? So Norman Augustine, who kind of, in a way, ran the Pentagon, but was the head of Lockheed Martin, he went personally to the small countries like Lithuania and Latvia and Poland and Czechoslovakia to convince them that they needed, quotes, democracy and to become part of NATO. Now, to become part of NATO, you have to invest about $3 billion in buying special weapons. Otherwise, you can't be part of NATO. And where would you buy the weapons from but from Lockheed Martin and Boeing, etc.? And that was all great. So in order to recover business, the military corporations encouraged all these little Eastern European countries to join NATO, right up to the border of Russia. And you can imagine what America would do if Russia moved into Canada. We are in Canada, and said, now, actually, with the cooperation of Harper, Canada's now actually part of the Russian bloc. America would go Burko, like they did when Cuba got some missiles, and America nearly blew up the world. I got to be very close to Robert McNamara, former Secretary of Defence under JFK, and he was in the Oval Office at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. He said to me, "Helen, you don't know how close we came to within 3 minutes of blowing up the planet." And I can give you many other instances where we've got as close as that. When America launched a weather satellite from Norway, they notified the Pentagon, the Kremlin in advance. The Kremlin lost the data, because the Russians often do that. The missile was picked up, and it was thought by the Kremlin to be a first strike, because when America, which still has a policy to fight and win a nuclear war, you win by knocking out the Russian missiles. You kill the missiles. Billions of people dying, that's just called collateral damage by the Pentagon. People don't matter, the missiles do, but to have a first strike, first you decapitate Moscow by hitting Moscow with several hydrogen bombs and kill Putin so he can't press his button. And then you drop 2 hydrogen bombs on each of the missile silos, 2, within seconds. And if the timing isn't accurate, you get what's called fratricide. So much debris is created from the first bomb, it shatters the second bomb coming down, so it's got to be perfectly timed. Now, the Russians don't want their missiles to be killed, so they'll lose a nuclear war, even though all their people will die. So they've dug a deep mountain in the Urals, and they've got a rocket there called the Dead Hand. And if they see that Moscow's been decapitated, they launch the Dead Hand, which sends a radio signal by computer, no human input, to all the Russian missiles to launch automatically. So that's their answer to the Americans' still plan to fight and win a nuclear war. We now have elected a very hawkish Senate, with John McCain heading the Senate Armed Services Committee, who's never seen a war he didn't like or didn't want to get into, even though he spent years in a tiger cage in Vietnam as a prisoner. So we're in a very invidious situation. And if you ask any American if the Cold War's over, they'll say yes, and they won't even think about nuclear war at all. Ebola's big time, HIV, that's disappeared. I mean, the latest thing happens, but no one thinks about this at all, except the Pentagon. And it's interesting, the language they use is very sexual, which would take me to why I'm writing my book, Why Men Kill and Why Women Let Them. Missile erectors, soft laydowns, deep penetrations, hard lines and soft lines, nuclear weapons blowing up with one big orgasmic whump. And the generals use these terminologies in front of women with no apparent embarrassment at all, indicating what's going on in their reptilian midbrains, fueled by testosterone. Now, I'll go back in history because this is relevant to ICAN. When I first went to America in 1978, most Americans, and I was at Harvard, most Americans I spoke to said it was better to be dead than red. In other words, have a nuclear war because they don't want to be communists. And I thought, these people are psychotic. And I said, well, what about the pygmies in Africa? They said, no, they don't want to be communists either. So it's better to have a nuclear war. So I organised all these physicians, 23,000 of us, and we got out to teach the American people about the medical effects of nuclear war by dropping a bomb on Boston, having a symposium at Harvard. And the journalists came and they said, what are doctors talking about nuclear war for? This is a political issue. We said, no, it's not, it's medical. And we described the medical effects. And the next morning, the Archbishop of Boston got up, or the Cardinal, whatever he was called, saw the map of Boston with the concentric circles of vaporization, third-degree burns and the like, and he said, I don't think Jesus would like this. So eventually the Catholic bishops got together and they produced a doctrine against nuclear war. Then the Methodist bishops did the same. And then we had the Southern Baptists. And then I went to see the head of the Mormon church, who was 96, an old man, because Reagan wanted to put mobile MX missiles on trains, each missile containing 10 hydrogen bombs, in Utah. So I was able to convince the head of the Mormon church that that would not be necessarily a good idea, so he banned it. I had an agent in Hollywood who offered to work for me for free, and she had all the film stars, you know, the best ones of the time, Sally Field, Lily Tomlin, Candy Bergen, you name it. And she'd say to 60 Minutes or to Phil Donahue, look, I'll give you Candy Bergen or Sally Field and Lily Tomlin if you'll take Helen Caldicott. Well, they didn't want any boring old doctor talking about the medical effects of nuclear war, because that would turn people off, and then they wouldn't buy their hemorrhoid cream or their teeth whiteners or their missile erector medicine, whatever it was. And so, but if you have a film star, that was a hook to hang me on. And I would go in after they'd been there and talked about the issue, and I'd talk about nuclear war. So by using the media in that way, and she put me in Vogue, Family Circle, Ladies' Home Journal, you name it, Life magazine, everything, then gradually Mr. and Mrs. Joe Sixpack learnt that nuclear war was bad for their health. I was even asked to the annual Morticians Association to talk about nuclear, and I said, why do you want me to talk to you about nuclear war? They said, we don't want to have to embalm radioactive bodies. And I said, well, you'll be one yourself, so don't worry. Anyway, they passed a resolution against nuclear war. So it became ubiquitous, and we got 1 million people in Central Park, and we were winning. We were on the crest of a wave. At that time, I was evicted from presidency of PSR by, I think, the CIA, and certainly we got the FBI documents, which were all blocked out. And PSR lost its way and started working on guns and insecticides and stuff. So we lost the impetus, but we were on the way to developing abolition of nuclear weapons, which is what you must do. But without educating the American people, Jefferson said, an informed democracy will behave in a responsible fashion. And what we must do is educate Mrs. Brown with her children following, and she's filling up her crate with Coke and stuff to feed the children. If she doesn't understand, no one will understand. In 5 years, we got 80% of people opposing the concept of nuclear war in America. The only way to do it is through the media. The media is determining the fate of the earth, and unfortunately, the media pretty well in America is controlled by one Australian called Rupert Murdoch, who actually created my career by publishing full front page editorials about the French tests early on, because he didn't like the French, and neither did most Australians like the French. And we stopped buying French perfume and French cheese and French wine. And eventually we took France to the International Court of Justice, and she was forced to test underground. But without the cooperation, without being able to get onto the media, we're nowhere. Doctors, on the other hand, have total credibility, because even the most hawkish politician has to go to the doctor if he gets appendicitis or he gets urethritis or prostatic obstruction or whatever. We have credibility, and that's why we're able to captivate the American population. And I'm sorry to put a dampener on what you're doing, because what you're doing is so noble and so important, but America doesn't care about anyone else. When you're the most powerful nation in the world, you don't really care what anyone else thinks. And most Americans don't understand geography anyway. And I'm not anti-American at all. I think they're wonderful people who really want to do the right thing, but they're not quite sure what the right thing is. As one Russian said during the Cold War, Americans have a curiosity a mile wide and an inch deep. But they are capable of doing the right thing once they understand. The Russians, if America starts to disarm, will follow, because they can't afford this crazy nuclear arsenal and crazy nuclear, and they're very well aware, having lost 30 million people in the Second World War. That's where the Second World War was won, on the Russian front. They're well aware of what war means. So I would say to you that we have to use our imagination, our intelligence, and our creativity to get to the American people. And I'm not sure how one does that now. I'm a permanent resident in America, but without that, it's not going to happen. That's just being realistic, and I'm sorry to put a dampener on the situation now. And good luck to everyone, all of us, including our children and grandchildren and all future generations. Thank you.
I think there are so many things that unite us, actually. This civil society campaign, this is the main objective. And of course, the physicians are at the forefront, whether they are the Red Cross, whether they are Helen Caldicott, Eric Notebaert, Nancy Covington, Dale DeWar. These people are pushing us in this struggle against nuclear weapons. I commend for their courage, ICAN.org, and the courageous don'tbankonthebomb.org, where I get all the numbers of all the American companies and Canadian companies feeding the nuclear complex. And you find, of course, a lot of companies owning the media. You have, for example, Power Financial Corporation investing $1.4 billion in the last 3 years in Lockheed Martin, as you said, Northrop Grumman, Honeywell. So this report by ICAN.org, I think, has been a forefront weapon for our struggle against the bomb. And of course, people like the Union Interparliamentarians with your compatriot Helen Weir, who is doing a fabulous job. The struggle also against NATO, and NATO that has persuaded our Prime Minister to go inside Ukraine right now. It's a disaster, this NATO with their weapons, atomic bombs, everywhere in Turkey and everywhere. We must fight this, and we have here Erika Simpson, who has written such fabulous articles about this subject. Murray Thompson from Pugwash, who gathered together 900 members of the Order of Canada to call for a convention against nuclear weapons. And they were imitated by the Order of Australia, who gathered even more. I think they're up to 1,000 now. So this is a fight going on, for example, for also objectives like a denuclearized Arctic Ocean, and objectives that we must fight for and we must continue to fight for. And every one of you here, I think, is marvelously involved in that fight. Donc, il s'agit de continuer ce combat.
So we need to keep on fighting, and we have more and more campaigns, more and more aware, more artists that I should also mention.